Her grandmother's death would not change much in her life. After all, the Moon family had lived at Viewmont from the time her parents were married. However, Lottie did think life around the plantation would be a lot less boring without her grandmother around trying to get Lottie to remember all the ins and outs of her family's history. There was just too much to remember. Lottie's great-grandfather, Thomas Barclay, had been a friend of Thomas Jefferson. He also had been dispatched by George Washington to be the first U.S. ambassador to France and Morocco. Lottie's uncle, Dr. James Barclay, now owned the old Jefferson homestead that was named Monticello. There was also the Moon side of the family, and more cousins than she could remember. Some of them related on both her mother's and her father's sides of the family. Double cousins, her grandmother had always called them when she tried to explain the family tree. Lottie continued listening to the pastor. "We all owe much to Mrs. Sarah Harris," he said. "She has been a generous supporter and benefactor of the Scottsville Baptist Church since its timely establishment over 6 years ago. I am sure many of you have read in the Baptist press that Mrs. Harris has made a munificent provision for us, even in her untimely death." The big words the pastor was using made Lottie's head spin as she tried to understand what he was saying. She guessed he was talking about the $100 her grandmother had given the church in her will. That was a large sum of money to most people, but Lottie had an idea it wasn't really that much to anyone in her family. She was old enough to have figured out that when it came to material things, she could have just about anything she wanted. She looked along the pew she was seated on. Beside her sat her oldest brother, 15-year-old Tom. He already had a fine gilded stallion of his own and a trap, a light two-wheeled carriage with springs, to go with it. Next to Tom sat 13-year-old Oriana, or Ori as the family called her. She loved to read, and their father had bought her an entire library of books, some of them in Latin and Greek, so Oriana could read whenever she wanted to. Isaac, or Ike, Lottie's other brother, was 2 years younger than Ori, but he wasn't interested in reading at all. Instead, Mr. Moon had bought him a fine hunting bow. Lottie sighed quietly as she thought about her 3 older siblings. They were all a bit too grown-up for her liking. All she wanted was someone who would play with her. Once, Oriana had whispered to Lottie that their mother had given birth to 3 other children, but they had all died when they were very young. However, Lottie did have one little sister, Coley. Coley's real name was Sarah Coleman Moon, after their grandmother, but for some reason the nickname Coley had stuck. Coley was only 3 years old, and Mammy, one of the household servants, looked after her, though with strict instructions from Mrs. Moon not to let the child out of her sight. To Lottie's dismay, Coley wasn't big enough to run through the cotton fields with her, climb the peach trees, or play in the packing shed, even if she could have escaped Mammy's watchful eyes. Coley wasn't even old enough to sit still in church, and she stayed home in the nursery while the rest of the family attended. Of course, this made Lottie feel very grown up. When the church service was over, the congregation spilled out into the warm spring morning. Lottie teamed up with some of her young cousins, and they played together as they walked down the stone path that led to the dusty road in front of the church. Finally, Lottie's mother, Anna Maria Moon, bustled Lottie and Ike toward the family's carriage. "It's time to go now," she said firmly. Lottie, who was halfway through telling her cousin James about how a pair of sparrows had nested in a hedge beside the kitchen, wanted to stay and finish her story, but she knew better than to argue with her mother. Mrs. Moon may have been only 4.5 feet tall, but when she gave an order, everyone, even Lottie's father, paid attention. Finally, Lottie scrambled